Ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge privilege for me to be leading a team that is carrying out what I really do believe to be a hugely important agenda. What I'd like to do today is, just before the tea break, set out our stall for you in the Fraud, Error and Debt Task Force and give you an overarching understanding of what our programme of activity sets out. This will primarily focus on cross-cutting fraud, error and debt activities. You'll hear a little bit later on from our colleagues in DWP and HMRC, where we'll go into a little bit more detail. So as Catherine mentioned earlier, a fraud, error and debt task force was set up in the summer of last year. This agenda is now being taken very seriously indeed. Ministers and senior officials have signed up to tackle financial loss jointly, and you've heard from both ministers earlier this morning how committed they are to this agenda. What has been invaluable is actually the input that we've had from local authorities as well, particularly Hackney and Ealing, and also the private sector, RBS, HSBC, Citibank, helping to advise us and critically challenge, and this is an important part of it, critically challenge government on this agenda. So having finally got an understanding of what the scale of the problem is that we face. Of course, even if we were to replicate the very, very best in the public and private sector, we would not reduce this number to zero, 38 billion. However, we are committed to stem preventable areas of financial loss, and we know that if we work collaboratively, and this is the real key, we can really improve on this. In a time when there is considerable focus on austerity measures right across the board, which is affecting every single one of us here today, as well as the government, it's imperative that we focus together on ensuring that this financial loss is significantly reduced. Just to give you a very brief outline of the task force timeline, we published an interim fraud report last summer. An interim debt report was published on Friday, the 3rd of February, and I'm very pleased to announce that today, after considerable effort and great collaborative effort, and there are a couple of people I do want to thank for getting this publication out, Lynn MacDonald from DWP, Mike Eland and Steve Lamy from HMRC, and many other colleagues, but I just wanted to highlight the real collaborative working of those individuals to help publish Tackling Fraud and Error in Government Today, which has come out. Our Cabinet Office colleagues, the ministers already touched on earlier, in the Behavioural Insights team, have also published their report today, and we'll be hearing much more about that later on. So, very importantly, what has the Fraud, Error and Debt Task Force achieved so far? We have focused on 8 pilots, particularly around the fraud area. The approach that we are using is to look where there are elements of excellence already within government. And we want to look at those approaches, analyse and replicate. As a result of this activity, you heard the Minister earlier mention, we've actually seen already a yield of 72 million, which has been achieved through these pilots. The task force is further ahead than the debt and error programmes. However, we now have a debt expert panel to support and challenge the debt programme. We are particularly grateful for the input of Ian O'Donnell from Ealing Borough Council, for Philip King with the Institute of Credit Management, and Frank Armour from Santander, as well as the non-exec director for HMRC, John Spence. It is really invaluable to get this amount of expertise together from very different sectors. If we just focus a little bit on fraud and error, here we outline the nature and the scale of fraud and error in the public sector. Areas of tax and benefits are very well known. However, there are other high expenditure areas around benefits, grants and payroll. And there is actually very little coordinated approach to these particular areas. With these issues actually being cross-government, the breadth of the problem is much wider, and the need for collaboration and coordination is much greater. Just to highlight the principles that we want to work with fraud and error. Our interim report outlined that we would look at 4 key areas: collaboration, assessment, prevention, and zero tolerance. If I can just pull out a couple of highlights, it's absolutely imperative. You heard both ministers earlier talking about sharing information, intelligence, and resources. We need to keep better assessing the data that we've got, and we need to keep making sure we are measuring the right data. It's an underpinning of the whole program of activity, actually understanding what the actual size of the prize is. Prevention is the most efficient way to reduce fraud loss, and this requires, as you heard earlier, for us to embrace the power of data analytics in order to end the pay first, then check culture of previous years. And we do want to also focus on zero tolerance, which I touch on later. So the real sort of outline that I wanted to share with you today is our program of activity, so that you can see exactly what action we are taking, the progress, and finally some of the next steps that we want to take, and very importantly also showing the collaborative approach that we're taking to this. Very important, fraudsters make multiple attacks across the public sector. The sharing of intelligence on known fraud and fraudsters must be absolutely the basis of the common defence we need to put up. You've heard James Brokenshire talk about that earlier. Working very closely with the NFA, we want to make sure that we develop a framework for sharing intelligence much more effectively. Central to this work will be the ability for public and private sector organisations to check information against known fraud data. This is, ladies and gentlemen, a very ambitious programme. It is a very complex programme. But in the coming months, we are going to detail and outline how we're going to tackle this to ensure that we get a very effective counter-fraud checking service across government. The Minister touched on spend recovery audits. The Home Office led the very first pilot on this, which was to detect overpayments through their accounts payable systems. This has also been rolled out to the Department for Transport. What is really important is that this approach actually gets proliferated right across government. I'm very pleased to say that in the last Fraud, Error and Debt Task Force, we actually had this mandated so that by December 2013, everybody across government will have gone through the spend recovery audit. Also, point to make here that this the approach that we're using is a payment by results basis, so there is very little risk to the department on this particular approach. Cabinet Office will be issuing guidance and support very soon on how we can work together to make sure that we achieve our plan for December 2013. Our Counter-Fraud Champions Network, this is what David Allen was going to talk to you about a little bit later. In the summer of 2011, we set up a Counter-Fraud Champions Network to strengthen our fight against fraud and support the work of the task force, really ensuring that departments have a single point of contact. And we're now looking to expand this to to error and debt. Moving to a check-first culture. HMRC have successfully piloted a screening technique for tax credit applications. The tool analyzes information provided by new and existing claimants on their tax credit application forms, compares this against internal and external data, DWP and Credit Reference Agency, and decides the likelihood of the application being fraudulent or erroneous. A very slick operation. A number of us have visited one of the sites in Netherton, and an extremely good example of an approach that we need to proliferate right across government. The government is committed to move to this check-first culture by 2015. The use of behavioural economics, you'll hear later on from this particular area, but we have released a publication alongside our fraud and error and debt reports, which outlines the finding of a number of pilots on the use of behavioural economics to prevent fraud and error. We are very fortunate later on, ladies and gentlemen, to have one of the world's leading academics who will be talking to us about the insights around behavioural economics. We want to make sure that we continue to work with our Cabinet Office colleagues on this particular area to ensure that we're focusing on other behavioural economic opportunities that actually will yield on fraud, error, and debt reduction. Fraud Expert Panel. This is about working with our colleagues in the Major Projects Authority and ensuring that we actually right up front, before a program goes ahead, embed a prevention shield for fraud and error. The creation of an independent panel, which is being championed by Anne Turner within the Major Projects Authority, will work alongside gateway reviewers to help ensure that we really do bring up right up front to the front end of our major projects and programs the shield, to make sure that we do not embed fraud and error into any new projects before they go live. Measurement. Very, very important to make sure that we are actually understanding exactly what some of the metrics are around fraud and error, as well as undertaking exercises in specific areas to detect fraud previously unknown to departments. To assist departments in completing their quarterly data summaries, Cabinet Office and the NFA have issued guidance on how to report and classify detected fraud and error. We will be having a breakout session later on when you can look at this in a little bit more detail. Fraud e-learning, you heard James Brokenshire earlier touch on this. We want to embrace a culture of zero tolerance across government. A generic fraud awareness e-learning tool will be developed by the NFA, and it is starting to already pilot now within the Home Office, and I'm very pleased to say that the Cabinet Office will be the very next pilot for this e-learning tool. The government is really committed to make sure that all civil servants undertake the e-learning program over the next 12 months. Grants review. A scoping study carried out by the NFA identified the awarding of grants as a significant fraud risk. Heard Francis Maud earlier. I want to reiterate, 80 billion is spent on publicly funded grants each year, with fraud costing at least 515 million. We actually think that an accurate figure could be higher than that. More needs to be done to understand how grants are administered and monitored across government, including who receives them and what the processes are for verifying and validating information provided on application forms. We will be undertaking a detailed review of grants administration to understand the end-to-end grant administration process. And we're hoping that a very similar approach to the sort of check first before actually making the payment will be able to be rolled out to the grants administration. Staff vetting enhancement. While government has strict vetting procedures for civil servants, this does not extend to checking data on staff that have previously been dismissed or sanctioned for fraud. Over the next year, government will identify the options available for introducing a checking service on known fraud and fraudsters for the purposes of vetting public sector fraud. So that really just gives you an outline of what the actual program of activity is that we've signed up today on the fraud and error report that you will have seen published. I'd like to move on to debt. Debt, we are about 6 months behind the program of activity on fraud. But again, to give you the overview, our first job was to actually work out the nature of the problem facing government. We spent the first 6 months really working across central government to map the scale and distribution of debt. The NAO has been absolutely invaluable in helping us quality assure these figures and understand the full debt picture. To give you a snapshot on debt, these are compiled really of write-offs plus the effective cost of the interest in holding a large stock of government debt. To give you a very quick snapshot, £25 billion of debt stock at the 31st of March 2011. Whilst the majority of these write-offs are within HMRC, most of this is due to insolvencies, which actually makes the recoupment of that debt very, very difficult indeed. Working with departments to understand how debt is currently being managed will inform some of the proposals that you'll find today in the report. Debt landscape. just so that you've got an understanding of the debt landscape, 95% of overdue debt is with DWP and HMRC, and there is some within the Ministry of Justice around fines. This is the first time, as I mentioned before, that we've actually understood what potentially the landscape looks like. Outside of HMRC, debt is with individuals. It's made up of fines, student loans, etc. The other, there is a plethora of different ways of managing our debt across government. We have different collection centres, third-party providers. It's very siloed and really very little lessons learnt or joining up in this particular area. And the focus has often been on enforcement rather than compliance up front. Our timeline. Want to be very clear on managing people's expectations. We've been gathering the data, publication of our report on Friday. We now want to develop an action plan and pilot new approaches up until the summer, excuse me, when we will then start to signpost exactly what some of our new approaches may be. Again, as with fraud, we want to work within principles of prevention, effectiveness, efficiency, and fairness. Prevention, investing and giving resources should be absolutely focused on preventing debt arising rather than enforcement and sanctions. Effectiveness, it's ensuring that organisations are supported to maximise their debt management and collection activities through investing in staff and, most importantly, sharing their information. And we want to really place that focus on debt measurement and make it consistent and accurate. Efficiency, silos have got to be removed. Opportunities need to be taken to achieve economies of scale, such as aggregating debt collection functions and jointly procuring debt services. Fairness. Minister for the Cabinet Office really stressed this earlier. It's imperative that we are fair to those who do pay their debts by taking a proportional response to those that don't. We've got to get tougher on the action on those who actually can afford to pay their debts and aren't. And we've got to support those who are in genuine hardship. If we just look at the areas of work that we've got ahead of us, if we look at debt analytics, the National Audit Office are actually going to lead the debt analytics strand to help us get a better understanding of the debt data and to take this further to establish metrics and benchmarks across departments. Plus, very importantly, we want to look at our peers internationally and also within the private sector. Business models. Working with our commercial portfolio team in the Cabinet Office, alongside HMRC and DWP and others, we will be looking at whether there is a case for bringing together debt functions from different parts of government. As part of this work, we'll be considering whether commercial models may be appropriate, such as joint ventures or mutuals, as well as looking at other models, such as shared services, where we can amalgamate functions, etc. Procurement and Crown contracts, we need to make sure that we as government are a more intelligent customer. At the moment, there are multiple contracts within and across departments with businesses that provide debt services, DCAs, CRAs. We want to get a better deal for government and establish Crown contracts. We've already seen within the Cabinet Office that this has worked extremely well with the way that we approach our supply relations. Legal powers. We're delighted that DWP are leading this strand of work to look at the legal sanctions that the government currently has in place on debt. There is a huge amount of inconsistency around this area, and we want to make sure that we have a much more consistent approach, that we won't pay and provide the right support to those that can't, and we focus a much tougher line on those that can with the appropriate sanctions. This strand will also look at the rather knotty issue of data sharing. And finally, professionalism. We want to look at how we can support the professionalism of staff working in debt management and collection as part of the overall wider operational delivery on professionalism. We'll be working closely with civil service learning and others who have created excellence in this area to look at the package of support and training available to staff. There are a number of areas where we've seen where people may be a caseworker in the first part of the day and a debt collector in the second part of the day. We need to ensure that there is a really good high level of professionalism. In summary, ladies and gentlemen, financial loss is an issue all departments need to focus on. Those who want to exploit government and actually exploit every single one of us in this room today, they don't let organizational boundaries get in the way. So shame on us if we let organizational boundaries get in the way of preventing. That is why it's imperative that this new direction set out in the publications that we've spoken about today is a journey that we all travel together. It is only with a sense of real collaboration between all of us here today that we will tackle this really significant financial loss that is affecting every single one of us today. So thank you very much for listening to our program of activity. What we're going to do now is break for tea. And I'd like you to take this opportunity to visit some of the trade stands that you'll see outside the back of this room. I would ask you if you could be back by 11:35. We are running to quite a tight agenda, where I'll be joined by Craig Boundy from Experian and Mark Moorman from SAS. So if we could have you back in the room for 11:35, that would be great. Thank you very much.